Ladies and gentlemen, let me start with making a couple of remarks. The three presenters of today don't know each other's talks, so we might contradict each other. I don't hope we do that, but that is possible. The second, we heard a historical talk about the Eichmann trial. I speak from the perspective of philosophy, of legal philosophy. We will have a legal perspective in the next speaker. And I have been allotted only 15 minutes. And that means that I don't have a written text. I want to make a couple of remarks, but I have, to a certain extent, have to improvise. Let me first start with the obvious question, the question that we raised. Why do 300 people show up? We all ask ourselves, why is there so much interest in Eichmann? And I think that the obvious answer to the question is that Eichmann has become an icon, a symbol of Nazi evil. He has recently entered into DVDs. I admit Eichmann's role in Conspiracy, I think, which is an excellent movie on the Wannsee Conference. Eichmann's role is not very large. I think the role that Heydrich has been allotted is much more important, but still he's there. He plays a role in Robert Harris. I can also recommend that. It's a thriller, but it's a very good thriller. Robert Harris's Fatherland, also on the Wannsee Conference. And recently, perhaps not everybody knows that Philip Kerr writes thrillers. And in one of the recent thrillers, the main character of the thrillers is Bernie Gunther. Bernie Gunther is a poliziotto in Germany, and he becomes a private detective, and then he gets convoluted in all kinds of story, and he travels together on a boat with Adolf Eichmann to Argentina. So he enters into our literary world. And I can admit, a small collection of DVDs on Eichmann. Now, why is that the case? Well, I think, I forgot my book. I think that's at least what many people say. And that we cannot really look at Eichmann independently from the way Hannah Arendt has portrayed Eichmann in this very influential book, Eichmann in Jerusalem. So we cannot really look at Arendt unless we look through the eyes of Hannah Arendt. And that's interesting because not only Eichmann became famous is perhaps not the word, but he became famous, let's put it famous, because of Hannah Arendt's report, but Hannah Arendt, of course, herself became a very important philosopher because of her book on the Eichmann trial. I doubt whether she would have the same prestige if only it depended on the human condition or on totalitarianism. Of course, and I think Dr. Burns' presentation already testified to that. It's not uncontested. It's not uncontested what Hannah Arendt has described in her book, and there is major criticism from one of the historians, I think, and I can recommend if you're really interested in the biography of Eichmann, then I would recommend Cesarani's biography. I liked it very much, and he also starts out in explaining how much our thinking about Eichmann is influenced by Hannah Arendt and how distorted our view on Eichmann is because of Hannah Arendt. I want to make a couple of remarks, like I said, and I focus mainly on Eichmann in Jerusalem, Hannah Arendt's book Eichmann on Jerusalem, and that is a contested book. And why is it contested? For several reasons. Hannah Arendt focuses on what a criminal trial is, and she says a criminal trial's main goal is to establish the criminal responsibility of the defendant. So the whole idea that the trial should also contribute to clarifying the history or to be an instrument for the legitimacy of the state of Israel is clearly rejected. And Dr. Byrne has very well elaborated on that. She says that the interference of the president and of Golda Meir, I think, in putting Hausner in place was very strong. Of course, one can ask oneself if a criminal trial, where not much public awareness of what had happened had already taken place, whether one should have such a limited view on the goals of a criminal procedure. The second remark, the second reason why Eichmann in Jerusalem, Hannah Arendt's Eichmann in Jerusalem is contested is because of the attention that Hannah Arendt draws in her book to the role played by the Jewish councils. And she drew, of course, on the important work, but the work was not very well known at that time, Raoul Hulberg's The Destruction of the European Jewry, if I remember well. And she emphasizes, but it's difficult, it's always tricky to really give names to how but she uses the concept of a cooperative attitude of the Jewish councils in the destruction of the Jewish Jewry. Therewith, she gave rise to what we now understand in Holocaust studies as the functionalist approach to the understanding of the Holocaust, like it was what had happened was really the result of a functioning bureaucracy. There are strong voices nowadays that contest this idea that it was a functionalist, of a bureaucratic thing, the Holocaust. In Holocaust studies, we make the distinction between the functionalist approach and the intentionalist approach, and there is much to be said in favor of the intentionalist approach. And if you want to hear a name for intentionalism, you could think of the work of Goldhagen, or you could think, and that's a much better, of the Browning book. The third element for which Hannah Arendt, of course, was contested is the thesis on the banality of evil. And insofar you don't know, I will quote. For when I speak of the banality of evil, I do so only on a strictly factual basis, pointing to a phenomenon which stared one in the face at the trial. Eichmann was not a Iago, not a Macbeth, and nothing could have been farther from his mind than to determine with Richard III to prove the villain. Except for an extraordinary diligence in looking out for his personal advancement, he had no motives at all, and this diligence in itself was in no way criminal. He certainly would never have murdered his superior in order to inherit his post. And this is he merely, to put the matter colloquial, never realized what he was doing. It was precisely this lack of imagination which enabled him to sit for months on end facing a German Jew who was conducting the police interrogation, pouring out his heart to the man and explaining and again how it was that he reached only the rank of lieutenant colonel in the SS, and that it had not been his fault that he was not promoted. So the third very contested element in Hannah Arendt's report is this thesis on the banality of evil, and Arendt, of course, goes at great pains to say that she is not reducing the evil itself, but that the banality of evil is a metaphor used to describe the criminal Eichmann, a small cog, a bureaucrat. Now, from a legal perspective, what can one say of the trial? Well, there are several problems in Hannah Arendt's report. One, with regard to the procedural aspect, Hannah Arendt gives a report of the discussions that took place on how to justify the fact that the Jewish state and a Jewish court could prosecute, have the legitimacy to, that it had the jurisdiction to prosecute Eichmann. The state of Israel was not in existence at the time that Eichmann committed his crimes, and of course the legislation on which he was tried also did not exist at the time, which would then be a violation of the nulla poena principle. Several options on answering the question of jurisdiction had been discussed: passive personality principle, universal jurisdiction, and in the end, to the astonishment of many, Arendt chooses for the territoriality principle. Last element that I want to last remark that I would like to make is that the problems that were there not only with the procedural, with the substantive. What exactly is the indictment that one with which Eichmann is confronted? And then we face this issue of the crimes against humanity, crimes against the humankind. The response that Eichmann gave, of course, that he acted in obedience. He was obeying the legal order, and he downplayed his role in the destruction of the European Jewry. Hannah Arendt comes up with this thesis of the banality of evil. He says Eichmann did he have a criminal intent? Well, it's difficult to know because he was a very banal person. He didn't really, and that's the quote he never really realized what he was doing. And if one then, of course, can prove that what he did was indeed criminal, what about Eichmann's mens rea? What about his criminal intent? Last remark then finally, Eichmann is depicted by Hannah Arendt in her book Eichmann in Jerusalem as a bureaucrat, as someone who was primarily obeying orders, who participated in a totalitarian regime that took away criminal responsibility from all the elements in this bureaucracy. Astonishingly, in Hannah Arendt's book, the issue of anti-Semitism does not play an important role. It looks as if she underplays the element of anti-Semitism in Eichmann. Cesarani, in his recent biography, says that's wrong. Eichmann was strongly motivated by anti-Semitism, and one of the examples to prove that is the extent to which he was involved in the killing, in the deportation of the Hungarian Jews in 1944. Cesarani's thesis is rather simple. When Hannah Arendt arrived in Jerusalem to report on the trial, she had just published her book on totalitarianism. We are in the early 60s, on the height of the Cold War. There was a strong urge to present the Soviet Union as a totalitarian regime, to make an equation between Nazism and the Soviet regime, and she basically saw what she wanted to see, namely an exponent of totalitarianism rather than an exponent of anti-Semitism. Cesarani says that Hannah Arendt was wrong in downplaying the element of anti-Semitism, and we have to make probably up our own minds. Thank you very much.